The Texas heat was relentless, pressing down like an iron hand as Rick Dawson gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The flashing red and blue lights in the distance cast eerie shadows across the pavement, but his eyes were locked on the little girl being wheeled into the ambulance. The girl who had been minutes away from disappearing forever. Could have happened so easily. A father and daughter walking out of a store. A car pulling onto the highway, blending into the sea of traffic. A border crossed before anyone even knew she was missing. And yet, something had stopped it. Not a flashing alert. Not a police search. Just one man. One man with a gut feeling. Rick exhaled, his heart still pounding as he turned to Margaret, who sat beside him, silent but knowing. He had been trained to fight wars, to defend his country, to stand against enemies in battle. But tonight, he had faced a different kind of war. And for the first time, he realized, his fight wasn't over. Not yet.
The summer sun blazed mercilessly over Laredo, Texas, casting waves of shimmering heat across the vast Walmart supercenter parking lot. The air vibrated with the hum of car engines, the occasional honk of an impatient driver, and the distant chatter of families moving in and out of the store. It was the kind of afternoon where the heat pressed down on everything, making even the simplest tasks feel exhausting. Rick Dawson guided his car into an empty parking spot near the entrance, the engine purring softly as he let it run for a moment. The cool air from the vents provided a temporary escape from the stifling heat outside, but he knew it wouldn't last. He turned to the passenger seat, where his wife, Margaret, sat, her hands resting in her lap, fingers slightly swollen from the relentless grip of rheumatoid arthritis. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" Rick asked, his voice carrying the deep, steady warmth of a man who had spent a lifetime taking care of others. Margaret attempted a small smile, though he could see the effort it took. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, rubbing one stiff wrist with the other hand. "These joints of mine aren't too happy today, and that long drive didn't help much either." Rick nodded, understanding without the need for more words. He had watched helplessly over the years as the arthritis slowly robbed Margaret of her mobility, turning simple tasks into daily challenges. It pained him to see her struggle, but if there was one thing he admired most about her, it was her resilience. She never complained, never wallowed in self-pity. She simply carried on, one day at a time. "Well, we're here now," he said gently, reaching over to give her hand a light squeeze. "Hold tight, sweetheart. I'll go in and grab your medicine. Do we need anything else while I'm at it?" Margaret furrowed her brow in concentration, mentally running through their needs. "Yes, dear. I need 2 medications, the methotrexate for my arthritis and the folic acid. Oh, and here's the prescription for the folic acid." She reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate as she fished out a folded piece of paper. Rick took it carefully, tucking it into the breast pocket of his button-down shirt. "Got it," he said, patting his chest lightly. "I'll pick up a few groceries too while I'm inside. You just rest here, okay? I won't be long." Margaret gave him a knowing look. "You always say that, but then you end up chatting with half the store." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Guilty as charged. But today I promise I'll be quick." He reached for the door handle, but hesitated before stepping out. The moment he cracked the door open, the Texas heat rushed in like a tidal wave, thick and suffocating. Pausing, he turned back to Margaret, his military instincts kicking in. "Lock the doors, sweetheart," he said firmly. "I know we're in a busy parking lot, but you can never be too careful." Margaret rolled her eyes, but nodded. "Yes, sir," she teased, though they both knew he wasn't being paranoid, just cautious like always. It was a habit formed over decades of military service, one that never truly left him, even in retirement. As Rick stepped out of the car, the pavement radiated heat through the soles of his sturdy boots. He shut the door and gave Margaret a reassuring nod before turning toward the entrance of Walmart, his posture straight and purposeful despite the oppressive warmth pressing down on him. Inside, the cool blast of air conditioning was a welcome relief, momentarily washing away the weight of the afternoon heat. The store was quieter than usual for a Friday, with only the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional squeak of shopping cart wheels breaking the silence. Families wandered the aisles, Elderly couples browsed the shelves, and solitary shoppers moved with quiet efficiency. Rick grabbed a shopping cart, the metal cool against his palms, and began to make his way toward the pharmacy section. Even after all these years, the routine of civilian life still felt foreign to him at times. The regimented world of the military had been his life for so long that something as simple as grocery shopping sometimes felt almost surreal. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. But just as he rounded a corner near the toy aisle, a small commotion caught his attention, one that, unbeknownst to him, would change the course of his entire day. As Rick maneuvered his cart down the aisles of Walmart, his mind remained half focused on the list of items Margaret needed and half distracted by the comforting hum of everyday life around him. Even after all these years in civilian life, there was something about these ordinary moments, the quiet conversations, the clatter of shopping carts, the distant sound of a child laughing, that felt strangely foreign yet oddly reassuring. As he turned a corner to near the toy section, a small burst of noise caught his attention. The cheerful chime of a child's giggle quickly faded into a frustrated sigh, followed by the low, clipped tone of a man speaking. Rick slowed his pace slightly, his years of training sharpening his awareness of the situation even before he could fully process what was happening. A few feet away, a young girl stood in front of a brightly lit display of toys, her tiny fingers clutching a figurine. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with a head full of soft blonde curls and a pink Hello Kitty shirt that seemed just a little too big for her small frame. She held the toy close to her chest, as if it were a treasure she had just unearthed, her eyes wide with silent pleading as she looked up at the man beside her. The man, whom Rick instinctively assumed was her father, was crouched down to her level, his face tight with irritation. He was dressed casually, a simple button-up shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he held himself that felt off. His posture was rigid, his fingers tapping against his knee with barely concealed impatience. "You don't need that," the man said, his voice low and firm. "Put it back. We're leaving." "But Miguel," the girl protested, gripping the toy a little tighter. "It's just one toy. Please." The man's jaw tensed. "I said no, Chloe. We don't have time for this." Rick lingered a few feet away, pretending to scan a nearby shelf, while keeping the interaction in his peripheral vision. Something about the way the man spoke to the girl didn't sit right with him. Parents denied their children toys all the time. Rick had done it himself with his grandkids. But there was a sharpness to this man's tone, a lack of warmth that made Rick's instincts twitch. Chloe's lower lip trembled slightly, but she didn't throw a tantrum or whine the way most kids her age might have. Instead, she looked at the toy in her hands for a long moment before hesitantly lowering it. She didn't put it back, though. Not yet. It was as if she were savoring her last few seconds with it, reluctant to let it go. Rick watched the exchange for a moment longer before deciding to step in, if only to diffuse the tension. He had no real reason to intervene, other than the nagging feeling at the back of his mind. But he figured a harmless comment wouldn't hurt. "That's a nice choice," Rick said, his voice easy and friendly as he approached. He nodded toward the toy in Chloe's hands. "My granddaughter has one just like it. She takes it everywhere with her." Chloe looked up at him, her face brightening slightly at the mention of another child who loved the toy as much as she did. But before she could say anything, the man snapped his head up, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in Rick's presence. "Mind your own business, old man." The man snapped, his tone sharp and defensive. Rick raised his hands in a placating gesture, not wanting to start an argument. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said calmly. "Just making conversation." The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, don't." He turned back to Chloe, his voice dropping again. "Let's go. Now." Chloe hesitated, giving the toy one last glance before reluctantly placing it back on the shelf. Rick watched as the man took her by the hand, not roughly, but with a sense of urgency that didn't match the setting. As they walked away, Rick caught the tail end of his words. "We need to go. Your new home is waiting." Rick's stomach tightened. "Your new home." The phrase lingered in his mind long after they disappeared down the aisle. There was nothing overtly wrong about it, nothing that could justify suspicion on its own. And yet, something about the way the man had said it, the way Chloe had looked at him with those pleading eyes, made Rick's instinct scream that something wasn't right. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where they had been, a deep unease settling in his chest. It was probably nothing. But then again, Rick's instincts had rarely failed him before. Rick couldn't help but smile as he watched the little girl, Chloe, clutching the toy with both hands, as if letting go of it would somehow make it disappear. It reminded him of his own granddaughter, Sarah, when she was about the same age. She used to do the exact same thing, hold onto a toy with all her might, as if sheer determination alone would make it hers. He could almost hear her tiny voice in his head, bargaining with him like a seasoned negotiator. "Grandpa, I really need this one," Sarah would say, eyes wide, her little hands gripping the toy as if her life depended on it. And Rick, being the doting grandfather he was, almost always caved. The memory warmed his heart, and before he even realized it, he found himself stepping a little closer, offering a friendly smile. "That's a nice one you've got there," he said, nodding toward the figurine in Chloe's hands. His tone was light, conversational, the way any grandfather might speak when seeing a child lost in the innocent joy of picking out a toy. "My granddaughter has one just like it. She won't go anywhere without it." Chloe looked up at him, eyes brightening slightly, as if the idea of another child loving the same toy made her feel understood. For a second, Rick thought she might say something, but before she could, the man beside her stiffened. The change in his demeanor was instant. His body tensed, his expression darkening as he turned to face Rick. "Mind your own business, old man," the man snapped, his voice laced with irritation and something else, something colder. Rick blinked, taken aback by the hostility in the man's tone. He had simply made a passing comment, nothing intrusive, nothing out of the ordinary. Most parents would have chuckled, maybe even responded with a polite remark about their child's love for toys. But this man, Miguel, as the girl had called him, reacted like a cornered animal. Rick raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said evenly, keeping his voice calm. "Just making conversation." The man's jaw tightened, his grip on Chloe's arm growing just a fraction firmer. He let out a sharp breath, like he was barely holding himself back from saying something worse. "Yeah, well, don't," he muttered, voice low but still edged with irritation. Then, turning his attention back to Chloe, he spoke more firmly. "Let's go. Now." Chloe hesitated for the briefest moment, her fingers still lingering on the toy. She glanced at Rick, her expression unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, something that didn't quite sit right with him. Was it sadness? Hesitation? Or something else entirely? Whatever it was, the moment passed too quickly for him to figure it out. She finally placed the toy back on the shelf, her small shoulders slumping ever so slightly as she let go. "Miguel Vastid Nuchimi." He took her hand, not aggressively, but with a tightness that suggested urgency, and started leading her away. Rick watched them go, his eyes narrowing slightly as they disappeared down the aisle. And that's when he heard it. Miguel's voice, quieter now, but just loud enough for Rick to catch the words. "We need to go. Your new home is waiting." Rick's stomach tightened. Your new home. The words shouldn't have meant anything. Parents said things like that all the time. Maybe they had just moved, maybe she was going to stay with relatives, maybe it was nothing at all. But something about the way Miguel had said it made the hairs on the back of Rick's neck stand up. There was no excitement in his tone, no reassurance, no warmth. Just urgency. Rick exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as he stood there in the now empty aisle. He was probably overthinking it. Maybe the man was just having a bad day. Maybe he was one of those overprotective, no-nonsense fathers who didn't take kindly to strangers striking up conversations. And yet, the look in Chloe's eyes, the way she hesitated before putting the toy back, the man's reaction, more defensive than it needed to be. Rick had spent years trusting his instincts, and those instincts had saved his life more times than he could count. They were telling him something now, a quiet but insistent voice in the back of his mind that whispered, "Something's not right." For a long moment, he stood there, staring down the aisle where they had disappeared. Then, with a deep breath, he shook his head and turned back toward the pharmacy. It was probably nothing. But deep down, Rick wasn't so sure. Rick lingered for a few moments after the man and the girl disappeared down the aisle, his thoughts swirling with a vague unease. He wasn't the type to interfere in other people's business. He had learned long ago that doing so often led to unnecessary trouble. And yet, something about that exchange gnawed at him, refusing to settle. The way the girl had hesitated before putting the toy back. The way she had glanced at him, not with the defiance of a child denied a toy, but with something else. Something softer, sadder. And then there was the man, Miguel, whose reaction had been far more aggressive than the situation called for. Rick exhaled, shaking his head, reminding himself that not every parent was patient. Some people were just quick to anger, especially in the heat of the day, especially when they were tired, especially when dealing with children who didn't always listen. He was about to push his cart forward when he heard the man's voice again, low but distinct enough to reach Rick's ears as they moved down the aisle. "Let's go. Your new home is waiting." Rick's fingers instinctively tightened around the handle of his cart. It was such an odd thing to say. The words themselves weren't inherently alarming, but something about the way the man said them sent a prickle of unease crawling down Rick's spine. Your new home. Why not just say home? Rick wasn't sure why that particular phrasing stuck with him, but it did. It felt wrong. Not in a way he could immediately explain, but in a way that made his instincts twitch uncomfortably. Maybe they had just moved. Maybe the man was her stepfather, and this was her first time staying with him. There were plenty of perfectly reasonable explanations. And yet, something about the way the girl had looked at him before walking away, her small shoulders drawn in, her hands fidgeting as she let go of the toy, made his gut churn. Rick exhaled sharply. You're overthinking this. He had spent a lifetime relying on his instincts. But those instincts had been honed for war zones, for battlefields, for threats that were direct and immediate. This was a Walmart, a toy aisle, a father and his daughter. Not everything was a crisis. Trying to push the thought aside, he turned his cart and made his way toward the pharmacy. The transition from the bright, chaotic toy section to the quiet, sterile atmosphere of the pharmacy felt jarring. Here, everything was orderly. Muted conversations, the soft beeping of a register, the scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. Rick stepped up to the counter, pulling out the slightly crumpled prescription from his pocket. The pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair neatly tucked beneath a cap, greeted him with a kind smile. Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you? Rick cleared his throat. I need to pick up 2 prescriptions, methotrexate and folic acid. He passed her the slip of paper, watching as she glanced over it with a practiced eye. Of course. Just give me a moment. She turned and disappeared into the back, leaving Rick alone at the counter. Normally, this would be the moment where he relaxed, took a breath, let his mind drift to the small tasks ahead, grabbing milk, checking if they needed more coffee, making sure Margaret had everything she needed. But his mind wasn't on Margaret's medication. It wasn't on groceries. It was still in the toy aisle. It was still with that little girl. Her face wouldn't leave his thoughts, that quick flash of disappointment, the way her fingers had tightened around the toy like she wanted to hold on to it just a little longer, the way she had looked at him, as if she had been about to say something but stopped herself. He tried to brush it off, to focus on the rhythmic clicking of the pharmacist's keyboard as she processed his order, but the feeling in his gut wouldn't fade. Rick had spent decades learning to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were whispering to him, warning him. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what. As Rick left the pharmacy, the plastic bag containing Margaret's medication tucked safely under his arm, he found his feet moving slower than they should have. His mind kept circling back to that little girl, the disappointment in her face, the way she had clung to the toy before reluctantly putting it back. It was silly, really. Kids got upset about toys all the time. It wasn't as if she had been in danger or anything. And yet, something about the whole interaction wouldn't let go of him. Maybe it was the way she had hesitated, how she had seemed to hold onto a moment of joy before being pulled away. Or maybe it was the man's reaction, quick, harsh, almost offensive. It wasn't just impatience. It had been something else. Rick let out a slow breath, rubbing his thumb over the plastic pharmacy bag. He could hear Margaret's voice in his head already, telling him he was overthinking it, that he had always had a soft spot for kids, especially little girls who reminded him of Sarah. Maybe that was all this was. Maybe. Before he even realized what he was doing, Rick's feet had changed direction. He wasn't heading toward the grocery section anymore. Instead, he found himself walking back toward the toy aisle. It was quieter now, a few stray shoppers browsing, a mother wrangling a toddler who had somehow managed to grab 3 stuffed animals at once. But the shelf where the little girl had stood was exactly as she had left it. And there, among the colorful plastic figures, was the very toy she had wanted. Rick reached for it, turning the package over in his hands. It was a small figurine, part of a popular children's show. The details were well made, the bright colors vibrant under the store's fluorescent lights. His eyes flicked to the price tag, $24.99. Not cheap. No wonder the girl's father hadn't wanted to buy it. But just below the price, a bright yellow sticker caught his eye. 20% off. Rick let out a soft chuckle. A discount. Well, that made it easier. He didn't know if he would see the girl again before leaving the store, but something in him wanted to buy it anyway. Maybe he would run into her and have the chance to give it to her. Maybe not. Either way, it was a small thing, a simple act of kindness. And if he didn't find her, well, Sarah could always use another toy. Decision made. He placed the figurine in his cart and turned toward the front of the store. The checkout lanes weren't too busy, just a few people ahead of him. As he waited, he glanced absently around, scanning the store without really thinking. But then, just as his eyes swept past the self-checkout area, they landed on a familiar little blonde head. There she was. The little girl, Chloe, stood by one of the registers near the exit, shifting her weight from foot to foot as the man, Miguel, finished paying for their items. From this distance, Rick could see the contents of the conveyor belt. Just a few items. A couple of snack bars. A bottle of water. A pack of gum. Nothing substantial. Something about that struck him as odd. A father and daughter shopping together, but no groceries, no necessities. Just a handful of things that looked like road trip snacks. Rick's grip on his cart tightened. Miguel didn't look around, didn't acknowledge anyone in line, didn't speak to the cashier. His movements were brisk, efficient, like a man in a hurry. Rick's heart started beating just a little faster. He turned back to the cashier in front of him. Come on, hurry up. He hadn't thought this through. What was he even going to do? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had to move quickly. His turn finally came, and he placed the figurine on the counter. Just this, the cashier, a middle-aged woman named Laura, asked, raising a brow. Rick nodded, handing over his card. Yeah, just this. And could you make it quick? Laura gave him a curious look, but didn't ask any questions. She scanned the item, bagged it, and handed it over. Rick barely heard her polite, "Have a good day," as he grabbed the bag and turned toward the exit. Miguel and the girl were heading out. Rick quickened his pace, slipping through the self-checkout lanes, weaving past shoppers. He didn't know why, but something told him he had to catch up to them. Now, Rick stepped out of Walmart, the rush of hot Texas air hitting him like a wall. The cool, artificial breeze of the store had been a temporary escape, but now the sun was in full force, baking the pavement and making the air shimmer like waves over the endless rows of parked cars. His eyes scanned the lot, searching. Then he spotted them. Miguel was walking briskly, his long strides forcing the little girl to half jog, just to keep up. She looked up at him once or twice, but he didn't acknowledge her. He just kept moving, his head slightly down, his focus set ahead. Rick didn't think, he just called out, "Hey there, kiddo." The girl turned immediately, her blonde curls bouncing as she looked over her shoulder. Her face lit up for a fraction of a second when she saw Rick, a small spark of recognition in her bright eyes. She lifted a hand and waved, a hesitant but friendly gesture. Rick smiled, lifting the plastic bag in his hand as he started walking toward them. "Got something for you," he said, keeping his voice light, easy. "Thought you might like it." Miguel stopped mid-step. His shoulders went rigid, and slowly he turned. His dark eyes locked onto Rick, sharp and unwelcoming. Rick ignored the tension radiating from the man and focused on Chloe instead. He pulled the figurine from a bag and held it out toward her. "I saw how much you like this," he said, offering her a small smile. "Thought you might want to take it home after all." Chloe's eyes widened, a glimmer of excitement breaking through the disappointment she had worn earlier. She looked up at Miguel expectantly, as if waiting for permission. But Miguel didn't even look at her. His attention was fully on Rick, his expression shifting from surprise to something far less friendly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Miguel's voice was low, dangerous. Rick kept his stance relaxed, but his grip on the toy tightened slightly. "Just wanted to do something nice. No harm in that." Miguel stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Rick and the girl. "You following us, old man?" His voice sharpened, each word laced with barely contained aggression. "Try to lure my daughter with toys? Were you some kind of creep?" Rick blinked, momentarily thrown by the accusation. "No," he said evenly. "Nothing like that. I just saw her earlier. Thought she deserved something nice." Miguel let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah? Well, we don't need your charity. And we sure as hell don't need you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Rick glanced past him, trying to catch Chloe's eye, but the excitement she had shown just moments ago had faded. She wasn't looking at the toy anymore. She was looking at him, and in her gaze, he saw something that made his stomach turn. Sadness. And beneath that, fear. Miguel grabbed her wrist, his fingers closing tightly around her small arm. "Come on," he said through gritted teeth. "We need to go." Rick heard again, that same phrase. "We need to go. Your new home is waiting." His pulse quickened. His instincts flared. This wasn't just an impatient father trying to wrangle his kid out of a store. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Miguel pulled Chloe forward, but before they could disappear between the cars, Rick took a step toward them. "Hold on," he said, his voice lower now, steadier. "Why don't we slow down for a second?" Miguel snapped his head around, his expression twisting into something more volatile. "Get lost," he spat. "I told you once already. Mind your own damn business." Rick didn't move. His feet were planted, his military instincts taking over, assessing the situation, calculating. Miguel was on edge. His hostility wasn't just annoyance. It was something more. There was a kind of urgency in his movements that didn't make sense. And Chloe wasn't saying anything. She wasn't tugging away, wasn't pouting like a child throwing a tantrum. She was just quiet. Rick had seen a lot in his lifetime. Things most men never had to witness, things he wished he could forget. And he knew, deep in his gut, that this was one of those moments where he couldn't just walk away. But he also knew pushing too hard could escalate things. So he exhaled, backing off just slightly. He met Miguel's eyes, holding his gaze just long enough to let him know he wasn't fooled. "All right," Rick said finally. "Take care now." Miguel didn't respond. He just yanked Chloe forward again, forcing her to stumble as he dragged her toward a dark-colored sedan parked near the edge of the lot. Rick watched them go, every fiber of his being telling him he needed to do something. Then, as Miguel opened the car door and ushered Chloe inside, Rick caught one last look from her. She turned back, her big eyes meeting his. And this time, there was no mistaking it. That was fear. Real, unmistakable fear. Rick's heart pounded. And then, without thinking, his hand was already in his pocket, fingers dialing before his mind had even fully caught up. He brought the phone to his ear, his voice steady, urgent. 911. What's your emergency? Rick didn't hesitate. My name is Rick Dawson. I'm at the Walmart Supercenter on San Bernardo Avenue in Laredo. I think I just witnessed a kidnapping in progress. Rick's fingers moved automatically, pressing the call button before his mind could even process what he was doing. The phone barely rang once before the dispatcher's voice came through, steady and professional. 911. What's your emergency? Rick took a breath, forcing himself to speak clearly despite the pounding of his heart. This is Rick Dawson. I'm at the Walmart Supercenter on San Bernardo Avenue in Laredo, he said quickly, his eyes locked onto the car where Miguel was fastening the little girl into the passenger seat. There's a man here with a young girl, blonde hair, Hello Kitty shirt. I think he might be taking her somewhere against her will. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Can you describe the man? Hispanic, mid-30s, dark hair, about 5'10". He's wearing jeans and a button-up shirt. He's moving fast, and the girl, she looks scared. She's not resisting, but something isn't right. Rick watched as Miguel slammed the car door shut. The little girl flinched but didn't move. She just sat there, staring out the window, her tiny hands folded tightly in her lap. "What makes you think the child is in danger?" the dispatcher asked. Rick clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. How could he explain something that wasn't tangible? "I spoke to them inside the store," he said, gripping the phone tighter. "She wanted a toy, and when I tried to make small talk, the guy got aggressive. He kept telling her they needed to go to their new home. It didn't sit right with me. When I saw them outside, she looked off, nervous. 'All right, sir. We're dispatching officers to your location now,' the dispatcher said. 'Please do not approach the vehicle or the man again. Stay where you are and wait for the officers to arrive.'" Rick exhaled through his nose, willing himself to stay, put even as every nerve in his body screamed at him to act. "I understand," he said, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. The line disconnected, and Rick lowered his phone, his eyes never leaving the car. Miguel had climbed into the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching for something in the console. The car hadn't moved yet. Maybe he was checking directions. Maybe he was waiting for something. Rick checked his watch. Seconds felt like minutes. He forced himself to step away from the parking lot and retreat toward the store entrance, positioning himself where he had a clear view of Miguel's car, but was far enough away to follow the dispatcher's instructions. It was agonizing just standing there. His instincts told him to do something, anything, but he had seen enough in his lifetime to know that rushing in without backup could make things worse. So he waited and watched and prayed that the police would get here before it was too late. Minutes passed, slow and excruciating. Then, at last, flashing red and blue lights appeared at the far end of the parking lot. Rick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The squad car pulled up, its tires crunching against the asphalt. Two officers stepped out, both moving with the calm efficiency of men who had answered too many calls like this before. One was older, with graying hair at his temples. The other was younger, sharper, her eyes scanning the lot as she adjusted the radio clipped to her vest. Rick stepped forward immediately, straightening his back out of habit. "You the one who called it in?" the older officer asked, his eyes landing on Rick's veteran's cap. "Yes, sir. Rick Dawson, retired military." The officer nodded, as if that explained everything. "All right, Mr. Dawson. Tell us exactly what you saw." Rick recounted everything. The encounter inside the store, the girl's strange demeanor, the man's aggressive response, and the gut feeling that had only grown stronger. He gestured toward Miguel's car, which was still parked where he had left it. "I don't have solid proof," Rick admitted, "but I know something's wrong. That girl looked scared, and the way he talked about taking her to a new home, it doesn't sit right with me." The younger officer glanced at her partner, her brow furrowed slightly. "Do you have any reason to believe the child was taken against her will?" she asked. Rick hesitated. That was the problem. The girl hadn't called for help. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't resisted. But that didn't mean she wasn't in danger. She didn't say anything outright, he admitted, but she looked at me like she wanted to. The older officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his chin. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but we can't just stop a guy because something doesn't sit right. Do you have any proof that this isn't her father?" Rick felt his frustration spike. "No, but do you have any proof that he is?" The officer shook his head. "Sir, if we had an active Amber Alert or a missing persons report that matched her description, it'd be different. But we don't." Rick clenched his jaw. "So what? You just gonna let them leave?" The younger officer softened her voice. "Sir, I understand where you're coming from, but we can't detain someone based on a gut feeling. If we had evidence of wrongdoing, it'd be a different story." Rick wanted to argue, wanted to make them see what he saw, but he knew how this worked. Without a direct accusation from the child or a confirmed missing person report, their hands were tied. The older officer sighed. "Tell you what, we'll do a quick patrol of the lot. If we see anything suspicious, we'll check it out. But unless we witness something, there's not much we can do." Rick could feel the helplessness creeping in, a sharp contrast to the instincts that had been honed through years of service. "I hope you're right," he muttered. The officers nodded and turned back toward their patrol car, ready to do a slow lap around the lot. Rick stood there, watching, feeling the seconds slip away. Then, he turned his eyes back toward the car where Miguel and the little girl sat. And his heart sank, because Miguel was watching the police, too, and he was gripping the steering wheel just a little too tightly. Then, as if making up his mind, he reached for the gear shift. Rick's blood ran cold. Miguel was about to leave, and the police weren't going to stop him. Rick's stomach twisted as he watched the officers exchange a glance, their skepticism evident. The younger one scribbled something in her notepad, but it was clear from her expression that she wasn't convinced. The older officer sighed, crossing his arms. "Mr. Dawson, I understand your concern, I really do. But unless we have evidence that a crime is being committed, our hands are tied." Rick clenched his jaw. What about the way she looked at me? The way he reacted in the store? You don't find that suspicious? The officer hesitated, then gave a small shrug. Maybe, but suspicion alone isn't enough. Rick exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. So you're telling me that unless that little girl starts screaming for help, you're just going to let them drive away? The female officer shifted her weight, her voice gentler but still firm. "Sir, if the girl had said something to you directly, if she had asked for help, or if we had any indication that she was in distress, we'd intervene. But from what you've told us, she hasn't." Rick was about to argue, but then the officer added something that made his pulse spike. "With all due respect, sir, could this be related to your military experience?" Rick froze. "What?" His voice was dangerously low, edged with something sharp. The officer lifted her hands slightly in a placating gesture. "I don't mean any offense, but sometimes after serving, especially in high-stress situations, our instincts they can make us see threats that aren't really there." A cold wave of disbelief washed over him. They thought this was him, his mind playing tricks on him. PTSD. Rick took a slow breath, trying to contain the anger rising in his chest. He had dealt with this before. People assuming that just because he was a veteran, he saw danger around every corner. That his instincts, the very ones that had kept him alive through years of service, couldn't be trusted anymore. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I don't have PTSD, he said, his voice controlled but firm. "What I do have is experience. And experience tells me something is very, very wrong here." The older officer's expression didn't change. "I'm not saying you're imagining things, sir, but we can't act on a hunch. If you see anything concrete, if the girl signals for help, if you see any actual crime taking place, then call us. But for now, we don't have grounds to detain him." Rick felt something inside him tighten. So that was it. They were just going to walk away. The officers gave him a small nod, then turned toward their cruiser. Rick watched, heart pounding, as they climbed inside and pulled out of the parking lot. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving him standing there, fists clenched, helpless. He turned back toward Miguel's car. The man was already watching him. A slow smirk curled at the edges of his mouth as he reached for the gear shift. Rick's stomach dropped. He's leaving, and no one's going to stop him. A sickening wave of dread rolled through Rick's gut as the sedan's brake lights flared red. He had tried to do the right thing. He had followed the rules. He had called for help, and the system had failed him. Failed that little girl. Miguel's car began rolling forward. Rick took a step toward it, then another. His heart was hammering now, his mind racing through every possible option. He had two choices. He could watch helplessly as they disappeared down the road, knowing in his bones that something terrible was happening. Or he could do something about it himself. Rick took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and made his decision. He wasn't letting that car out of his sight. Rick walked back toward his car, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. His heart still pounded with frustration as he replayed the conversation with the officers over and over in his head. They hadn't listened. They had dismissed his concerns like he was some paranoid old man. Like his instincts that had been honed through years of service, meant nothing. Margaret looked up from the passenger seat as he approached, her face immediately shifting to concern. She rolled down the window, her brow furrowing as she took in his expression. "Rick, what happened?" He let out a slow breath, reaching for the door handle, and sliding into the driver's seat. The car was still cool from the air conditioning, but it did nothing to soothe the heat simmering in his chest. "They're not going to do a damn thing," he said, shaking his head as he tossed the plastic pharmacy bag onto the center console. "The cops showed up, asked a few questions, and then told me they couldn't do anything because I don't have proof." Margaret frowned. "But that doesn't make sense. You told them the girl was scared, right?" Rick exhaled through his nose, gripping the steering wheel. "Yeah, and they think it's just in my head. Said I might be overreacting because of my military experience." His voice dripped with frustration at the words. "Like I'm some shell-shocked veteran seeing threats that aren't really there." Margaret's expression hardened. "Rick Dawson, if there's one thing I know after all these years, it's that your instincts are rarely wrong. And if you say that little girl is in trouble, then I believe you." Her words cut through the anger, grounding him. He turned to look at her, his gaze searching hers. "You really think so?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Margaret didn't hesitate. "I know so." Rick sighed, running a hand down his face. He wanted to believe the police had been right, that this was nothing more than an overprotective grandfather seeing danger where there was none. But that look in Chloe's eyes, the way she had hesitated, the way Miguel had reacted, it was gnawing at him, relentless and unshakable. He was about to say something when movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A car pulled out of space near the far end of the parking lot. Dark-colored sedan. Rick's heart kicked up a notch. His head snapped toward it just as the vehicle passed under a street lamp, and for the briefest moment, he saw her. Chloe, in the passenger seat. She wasn't looking out the window, wasn't gazing at the world like most kids her age would. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clasped together in her lap. And then, just before the car turned toward the exit, she glanced sideways. Right at him. Rick didn't think. He moved. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life as he threw the car into reverse. Margaret startled, gripping the door handle. "Rick, what are you doing?" He didn't take his eyes off the sedan as it merged onto the road. "Following them." Margaret blinked, then let out a breath. "I had a feeling you were going to say that." Rick glanced at her. "You okay with that?" Margaret held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "You're not the only one with instincts, you know. If you say something's wrong, I trust you. Let's go." Rick pressed the gas pedal, maneuvering out of the parking lot and onto the road. The sedan was a few car lengths ahead, weaving through traffic. He kept his distance, his grip firm on the wheel, his pulse steady with a focus he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know where this was going to lead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't letting that little girl out of his sight. The dark-colored sedan moved steadily down the highway, its taillights glowing red in the dimming evening light. Rick kept his distance, his hands gripping the wheel as he maneuvered through traffic, careful not to get too close, but never letting the car slip from his sight. Margaret sat beside him, her posture tense but composed, watching the road with the same quiet determination she had carried through all their years together. She didn't ask him to turn around, didn't question his decision. She trusted him, and that meant everything. For the first few miles, the drive seemed normal. The sedan wasn't speeding or making erratic turns. It moved like any other vehicle, blending in with the late afternoon traffic. But then Rick noticed something. Miguel wasn't heading toward a residential area, a school, or any place that made sense for a father and daughter to be going. Instead, the sedan took an exit leading away from the city toward the outskirts, and then further. Rick's grip on the wheel tightened. The further they drove, the more isolated the surroundings became. Buildings thinned out, replaced by vast stretches of dry Texas land. The occasional gas station or truck stop punctuated the otherwise empty road, but beyond that, there was little but dust and desert. And then, in the distance, Rick saw it. The border. The metal fence that marked the dividing line between the United States and Mexico stood tall against the horizon. They were heading south, toward the crossing points, toward an area known for fast, undocumented movement across the line. A cold realization settled into Rick's bones. He wasn't just running away. He was trying to disappear. Up ahead, the sedan's turn signal blinked, and Miguel veered into the lot of a small, nearly deserted gas station. It was the kind of place most travelers skipped. One worn-down building, a single attendant, an expanse of cracked pavement stretching toward the highway. A few trucks were parked along the edges, but there was little activity. Rick slowed his car, pulling off onto the shoulder a safe distance away. He didn't want to be seen, not yet. Margaret scanned the scene. "Why stop here?" she murmured. Rick watched as Miguel pulled up to a pump, but didn't immediately get out. Instead, he leaned over the console, fiddling with something. Then, after a moment, he stepped out, leaving the driver's side door open. But it wasn't the open door that caught Rick's attention. It was the trunk. Miguel had popped it open, but didn't take anything out. He simply left it that way as he walked briskly toward the gas station store, pushing the door open and disappearing inside. Rick's stomach churned. Something was wrong. Then he turned his eyes back to the sedan. The girl hadn't moved. She was sitting in the passenger seat, just as she had been when they left Walmart. But now, something about her posture struck him as off. Too still. Rick narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "Margaret, do you see that?" Margaret followed his gaze. "She's not moving." A cold wave of unease washed over him. Rick reached for the door handle, pushing it open. "Stay here." Margaret's fingers tightened around his arm. "Rick, be careful." He gave her a reassuring squeeze before stepping out of the car. Moving quickly but cautiously, he crossed the pavement, keeping his eyes on the gas station's entrance. Miguel was still inside, out of sight. When he reached the sedan, he peered through the passenger side window. His pulse stuttered. Chloe was slumped in the seat, her head tilted slightly to the side, her eyes half closed. Her small hands rested limply in her lap, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. She looked dazed, drugged. Rick's eyes darted down to the center console, and that's when he saw it. A small open bottle. The label was turned slightly away, but he could make out just enough. Some kind of liquid medicine. A child's dosage. Rick's breath hitched. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a sleeping child nodding off on a long drive. She had been given something, and she hadn't had a choice. Rick didn't hesitate. His hand was already in his pocket, dialing 911 for the second time that day. The line clicked, and the dispatcher's voice came through. 911, what's your emergency? Rick kept his voice steady, urgent but controlled. This is Rick Dawson. I called earlier about a possible abduction at Walmart. I'm at a gas station near the border now, off Highway 83. I found them. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. The man and the girl? Yes, Rick said, keeping his eyes on the gas station doors. The girl is in the car. She looks unconscious. I think she's been drugged. A pause. Then more urgency. Can you confirm she's breathing? Rick's heart hammered. Yes, but it's slow. She's out of it. We're sending units to your location now. Stay where you are, and do not approach the vehicle or suspect. Rick swallowed hard, but his jaw tightened. Miguel was still inside the store. But for how long? Rick had minutes, maybe less, before the man came back out, got into that car, and took that little girl across the border. And if that happened, there would be no getting her back. Rick tightened his grip on the phone. I'll wait, he said, his voice calm. But you need to get here fast. Rick stood beside the sedan, his body tensed, every nerve in his being on high alert. The dispatcher's words echoed in his ear. Stay where you are. Do not approach the suspect. But Rick knew something they didn't. There wasn't time. Miguel was inside the gas station now, but he wouldn't stay there long. And when he came out, he would get in this car, drive across the border, and disappear, taking that little girl with him. Rick's mind raced. He was trained for moments like this, but this wasn't a war zone. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a quiet, nearly deserted gas station on the edge of Texas. And yet, this felt just as dangerous. He checked the road, searching for any sign of the police. Nothing yet. Then, through the glass doors of the gas station, he saw movement. Miguel. He was at the counter, his back turned toward Rick, his hands resting on the counter as the clerk bagged his items. Rick squinted, trying to make out what he was buying. Duct tape, wet wipes, a prepaid phone. Rick's stomach turned. Classic signs of human trafficking. The kind of items that didn't leave a paper trail. The kind of supplies someone used when they didn't want to be found. His hands clenched into fists. Inside the car, the girl still hadn't moved. Her breathing was slow, shallow. He had no idea how long she'd been like that, or how much of whatever was in that bottle had been given to her. Then Miguel grabbed the plastic bag, nodded once to the cashier, and turned. Rick took a slow, steady breath. This was it. Miguel pushed through the gas station doors and stepped outside, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the pavement. His steps were quick, determined, his eyes already locking onto his car. And then he saw Rick. Miguel's face twisted into shock for half a second. Then fury. "You," he spat. Rick didn't move. Miguel's grip on the plastic bag tightened as his eyes darted from Rick to the car, then back again. He was calculating, measuring his chances. Rick already knew what was going to happen. Miguel wasn't going to run. He was too close to the border, too close to disappearing. He wouldn't give up now, and Rick wasn't going to let him leave. Miguel took a slow step forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're making a mistake, old man," he growled. "Get out of my way." Rick's voice was calm, steady. "Not happening." Miguel's nostrils flared. His free hand twitched like he was fighting the urge to grab something. "The cops are on their way," Rick continued. "They know you're here." For the first time, Miguel hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the highway. Rick saw the moment his mind made a choice. The bag in Miguel's hand dropped to the pavement, and in a single, fluid motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. A small, sharp folding blade, glinting under the Texas sun. Rick's heart didn't race. His breathing didn't change. His body shifted just slightly, years of training taking over. Miguel took a step closer, flipping the knife open with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Last chance," he hissed. "Move, or I swear." He lunged. Rick dodged. The blade missed his ribs by inches as he sidestepped, his movements quick despite his age. Miguel stumbled forward slightly, caught off guard by the speed of Rick's reaction. And that's all Rick needed. In an instant, Rick's hand shot forward, gripping Miguel's wrist with an iron hold. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the man's arm in a direction it wasn't meant to go. Miguel let out a pained grunt. But before he could recover, Rick used his free hand to drive an elbow straight into his gut. The air left Miguel's lungs in a harsh wheeze. His grip on a knife loosened, just enough for Rick to pry it from his fingers and fling it across the pavement, where it skittered out of reach. Miguel staggered back, fury twisting his features. "You!" Rick didn't give him a chance to recover. He stepped forward, using his weight to force Miguel onto the pavement. He pinned him there, gripping his arm behind his back in a hold Miguel wouldn't be escaping from anytime soon. Miguel thrashed, his breath coming in sharp, angry bursts. "Get off me!" Rick leaned down, his voice low and cold in Miguel's ear. "You're not going anywhere." Then, finally, Rick heard it. The sound of sirens. The wail of police cruisers growing louder, getting closer. Miguel stopped struggling. His body tensed beneath Rick's grip as realization dawned. He had lost. Rick lifted his head just as the first police car came screeching into the lot, kicking up dust and gravel. Doors flung open, officers rushing out with their hands on their holsters. "Police!" Rick slowly lifted his hands, keeping his posture calm. "I've got him," he called out. One of the officers rushed forward, reaching for his cuffs. "We'll take it from here, sir." Rick nodded, stepping back as the officers swarmed in, locking Miguel's wrists in metal restraints and hauling him to his feet. Rick exhaled, rolling his shoulders as the weight of the moment started to settle. Then he turned, and his eyes landed on the car. The little girl still hadn't moved. Rick's chest tightened, and just as he started forward, the paramedics arrived. Red and blue lights flashed across the pavement, illuminating the chaotic scene as officers swarmed the gas station lot. Miguel, now handcuffed, was being hauled toward the back of a patrol car, his face twisted in anger and defeat. He thrashed once, but the officers quickly tightened their grip, shoving him against the hood as they patted him down. Rick stood nearby, his breath slowing as the adrenaline in his veins finally began to settle. His muscles ached, reminding him that he wasn't as young as he once was, but he didn't regret a single second of what had just happened. One of the officers stepped forward, a seasoned-looking detective with a sharp, assessing gaze. "Mr. Dawson?" Rick straightened instinctively, nodding. "That's me." The detective extended a hand, and Rick shook it firmly. "I'm Detective Martinez. I need to say, what you did here tonight, You likely saved that little girl's life." Rick's throat tightened at the words. He nodded but said nothing, his focus shifting back to the car. "She's still in there," he murmured, his pulse picking up again. "She hasn't moved." At that moment, two paramedics rushed past him, one carrying a medical bag, the other pushing a gurney. Rick followed, his boots crunching against the gravel as they reached the sedan. One of the officers who had been searching the vehicle stepped back, giving them room. "We found an open bottle of children's medicine in the front seat," he reported. "Most of it's gone. We're not sure how much she was given." Rick's chest tightened. The paramedics carefully opened the passenger door. One of them leaned in, gently pressing 2 fingers against the girl's neck, checking her pulse. A moment later, he nodded. "She's breathing. Pulse is weak but steady." Relief coursed through Rick, but it was short-lived as he watched them work quickly, checking her vitals, speaking to each other in clipped, urgent tones. "She's been drugged," one of them confirmed. "Most likely to keep her quiet during transport." Transport. Rick swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists. He had been right. If he hadn't followed them, if he hadn't stepped in, this little girl would have disappeared, gone across the border, lost forever. One of the paramedics carefully lifted the girl from the seat, cradling her small frame as they laid her onto the gurney. She looked so fragile, so impossibly small. Rick felt a weight settle on his chest, heavy and suffocating. How many others had been taken like this? How many never got saved? The gurney's wheels rattled as they pushed her toward the ambulance. The back doors swung open, and the paramedics lifted her inside, securing her for transport. Rick stood at the edge, watching his jaw tight. Then, just as one of them reached to close the doors, a soft, barely audible sound stopped them. A whisper, a name. "Miguel." Rick's breath caught. The paramedic leaned down. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" The girl's eyelids fluttered. She was groggy, her tiny voice barely above a whisper. "W, where am I?" The paramedic placed a gentle hand on her forehead. "You're safe now. We're taking you to the hospital, okay?" Her gaze was unfocused, confused. Then she turned her head, just slightly, just enough to see Rick standing there. Recognition flickered in her dazed expression. "You're the man from the store." Rick swallowed past the lump in his throat. "That's right," he said gently. "You're safe now, kiddo." The girl blinked slowly, then her eyelids drooped again. She was too weak to stay awake, too drugged to fully comprehend what had happened. But Rick knew one thing for sure. She was alive, and she was going home. As the ambulance doors swung shut, Detective Martinez stepped up beside him, his arms crossed as he watched the flashing lights bathe the gas station in streaks of red and blue. "Hell of a thing," the detective murmured. Rick exhaled, shaking his head. I almost didn't follow him. "The police back at Walmart." He let out a humorless chuckle. "They told me I was imagining things." Martinez's jaw ticked. "They didn't have the full picture, but you did." Rick turned to face him. "What happens now?" Martinez nodded toward the patrol car where Miguel sat in the back seat, his head bowed, hands cuffed behind him. "We run his prints, check for outstanding warrants. But given what we found on him," he shook his head, "this guy isn't some random kidnapper. He's a trafficker, and that little girl was cargo." Rick's stomach turned. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through his spine. Martinez continued. "We searched his wallet. He's carrying multiple fake IDs, different names, different states. He was planning to take her across the border. Once that happened, he trailed off, his expression dark. Rick didn't need him to finish the sentence. Once she was across the border, she would have vanished. No paper trail, nowhere to find her. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. "How many others has he taken?" Rick asked quietly. Martinez sighed. "That's what we're going to find out." Rick nodded, his jaw tight. The detective studied him for a moment. Then, his expression softened. "You did good, Dawson," he said. "Real good." Rick let out a slow breath, nodding once. Then he turned toward the lot, toward the car where Margaret sat, waiting for him. As he walked toward her, the weight of the night pressed down on him, exhaustion creeping into his bones. But beneath it, there was something else. Something lighter. Something that told him he had done exactly what he was meant to do. He opened the driver's side door, sliding in beside Margaret. She reached for his hand immediately, squeezing it tightly. "She's safe?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. Rick nodded. "Yeah, she's safe." Margaret let out a breath, leaning back against the seat. "Good." Rick stared out the windshield for a moment, watching the flashing lights in the rearview mirror, watching the officers finalize the arrest, watching as the little girl was taken to safety. Then, finally, he turned the key in the ignition. And as he drove away, he realized something. For the first time in a long, long while, he felt like a soldier again. Rick stood near the ambulance, his arms crossed over his chest, watching as the paramedics worked carefully inside. The little girl, Chloe, he now knew, was beginning to stir, her tiny body shifting slightly on the gurney. One of the paramedics leaned over her, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, can you open your eyes for me?" A small, tired murmur escaped her lips, barely audible over the background noise of police radios and the murmurs of officers moving about the gas station lot. Rick held his breath. Then, slowly, Chloe's eyelids fluttered open. She blinked, dazed, her unfocused gaze darting around in confusion. The harsh overhead lights from the ambulance reflected in her wide, frightened eyes. Her breathing hitched, and for a moment, she looked ready to panic. Hey, the paramedic soothed, brushing a hand over her forehead. "You're okay, sweetie. You're safe." Chloe's small chest rose and fell rapidly. Her fingers twitched against the blanket covering her, her mind trying to catch up with what was happening. Then her gaze shifted and landed on Rick. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression flickering between recognition and uncertainty. Then, her small voice, still groggy and weak, barely above a whisper. You're the man from the store." Rick swallowed the lump forming in his throat and stepped closer. "That's right, kiddo." He offered her a small, reassuring smile. "We met back at Walmart, remember?" Chloe nodded slowly, as if piecing together memories from a foggy dream. You wanted to give me the toy." Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, I did." The paramedic gently squeezed Chloe's hand. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" Chloe turned her head slightly, blinking up at the paramedic before answering. "Chloe Parker. I'm 6. Rick felt something in his chest tighten. Hearing her say her name made it real. Chloe Parker. Not just a little girl in trouble. Not just a face in a crowd. A child. Someone's daughter. Someone's whole world. "Chloe," the paramedic said softly. "Do you remember what happened before you got here?" Chloe's small fingers fidgeted with the blanket, her brows knitting together as she tried to recall. "Miguel," she whispered. Rick's stomach turned at the name. Chloe looked down at her hands. "He was at my school," she said slowly, her voice barely above a murmur. "He told me he was a friend of my mom and dad." Rick felt Margaret's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. He hadn't even realized she had stepped beside him, but he welcomed her presence. Chloe continued, her words coming slower now, as if the effort to remember was tiring her. "He said they had a surprise for me. A new home." Her tiny fingers tightened into the blanket. "I told him I was hungry and thirsty." Rick's jaw clenched. Chloe blinked, her lips trembling slightly. "He said we could get something at Walmart, that I could pick something for my new room." She hesitated, then sniffled. But then he changed his mind. Rick exchanged a glance with a detective standing nearby. Chloe's voice grew even softer. "After I got back in the car, he gave me something to drink." Her nose scrunched as if she could still taste it. "I don't remember what happened after that." Rick exhaled through his nose, anger tightening his chest. She had trusted him. She had been hungry, thirsty, innocent, and he had used that against her. The detective stepped forward, keeping his voice gentle. "Chloe, do you remember what your parents' names are?" Chloe nodded, her bottom lip quivering. "Mommy is Amanda Parker. Daddy is David." Detective Martinez nodded to one of the officers nearby. "Get their names in the system, find the parents." Rick barely had time to process that before the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A silver SUV whipped into the gas station lot, coming to an abrupt stop just beyond the police cruisers. The doors flew open, and before the vehicle had even fully stopped, a woman and a man bolted from inside. "Chloe!" The desperate cry came from the woman. A blonde, frantic, her tear-streaked face filled with panic as she ran. A police officer stepped forward, ready to intercept them, but Detective Martinez held up a hand. "Let them through." Rick stepped aside just as the woman reached the ambulance, her breath coming in broken gasps. Chloe turned her head at the sound of her mother's voice. And the second her eyes landed on her parents, the dam broke. "Mommy, Daddy," her small voice, fragile but full of desperate relief, cracked as tears welled in her eyes. The woman let out a choked sob and reached for her daughter, nearly collapsing onto the gurney as she wrapped her arms around Chloe. The man, her father, stood beside them, his own face lined with anguish as he rested a hand on Chloe's back, his eyes wet. Rick looked away, giving them a moment of privacy. He had seen too many families torn apart. It was good to see one being put back together. After several long moments, Chloe's mother lifted her tear-streaked face, looking around wildly, until her eyes landed on Rick. "You," she breathed. Rick turned fully toward her. "Ma'am." She let go of Chloe just long enough to step toward him. "You're the one who saved her?" Rick hesitated. He hadn't done it alone, but in the end, he had been the one who refused to let it go. He gave a small nod. I saw something that didn't seem right. I couldn't ignore it." The woman let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Her husband stepped forward, reaching into his wallet. "Please let me." Rick held up a hand. "No," he said firmly. "Keep it." The man faltered, but Rick shook his head, his voice softer now. "You don't owe me anything. Just take her home." Chloe's mother wiped at her tears, nodding. "We will." Her voice broke. "We thought we lost her." Rick swallowed past the lump in his throat. "You didn't." The little girl who had almost been lost forever was now wrapped in the arms of the people who loved her most. And that was enough. Chloe, still clutching her mother's sleeve, suddenly turned her sleepy gaze back to Rick. "You got me the toy?" she murmured, blinking up at him. Rick chuckled, reaching into the plastic bag he had carried all this time. He pulled out the figurine, the one she had wanted so badly back at Walmart, and handed it to her. Chloe's small fingers wrapped around it. "Can I put on my backpack?" "Of course," Rick said gently. One of the officers handed her the small pink backpack they had found in Miguel's car. With slow, groggy movements, Chloe clipped the toy to the zipper. She looked back at Rick, her exhausted face breaking into a small, grateful smile. "This way, I'll always remember you." Margaret had been standing quietly beside Rick the entire time, her warm, steady presence grounding him. She had seen the worry in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. But now, as she watched Chloe safely tucked in her mother's arms, she reached into her purse and pulled out the small plastic bag he had carried all this time. "Rick," she murmured, pressing it into his hands. He looked down, his rough fingers brushing over the thin plastic, and then back up at her. "It belongs to her," Margaret said softly. Rick swallowed, then turned back to the little girl, who was still curled against her mother's chest. Her small eyes were barely open, exhaustion pulling at her, but when she saw Rick step closer, she lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. "I think this is yours," Rick said, pulling out the figurine she had wanted so badly. He knelt slightly, holding it out to her. Chloe blinked, staring at the toy in his outstretched hand as if she couldn't quite believe it. Then, slowly, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You got it for me?" Rick nodded. "I did." She reached out, her tiny fingers curling around the toy, holding it close as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I was going to give it to you back at Walmart," Rick said, his voice gentle. "I figured if I saw you again, I'd make sure you had it." Chloe's smile widened just a little. Then, with slow, careful movements, she reached for her pink backpack, the same one the officers had found in Miguel's car. She clipped the toy onto the zipper and tugged at it lightly, watching as it dangled there. She looked up at Rick, her small voice soft but certain. "Now I'll always remember you." Rick felt his throat tighten, his chest ache in a way he hadn't expected. He nodded, offering her a small, warm smile. "That's a good idea, kiddo." Chloe's parents exchanged a glance before her father stepped forward, his expression filled with gratitude. "Sir," he said, pulling out his wallet, "please, let us do something. A reward, anything." Rick shook his head. "No thanks necessary." he said firmly. "I'm just glad she's safe." Chloe's mother wiped at her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. "But," Rick lifted a hand, stopping her gently. "Take her home. That's all the thanks I need." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the night settling between them. The flashing lights of the police cars still painted the lot in red and blue. But for the first time since this all began, Rick felt a sense of peace. Chloe was safe. That was all that mattered. The drive to the police station was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the distant echoes of sirens fading into the night. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, leaving Rick feeling every one of his 60-something years. His muscles ached from the brief struggle with Miguel, his knuckles were scraped, and exhaustion pulled at his bones. But his mind was sharper than ever. He glanced over at Margaret, who sat beside him, her fingers gently resting on his arm. She had been his rock through everything. The voice of reason when his emotions ran too high, the steady hand guiding him when doubt threatened to creep in. She hadn't questioned him once tonight, hadn't hesitated to follow him into something that most people would have ignored. And now, as she looked at him with quiet pride, he knew she understood exactly what was running through his mind. "You know," Rick murmured, adjusting his grip on the wheel, "I spent my whole life serving my country. I thought when I retired, that part of my life was over." Margaret watched him carefully, waiting for him to finish his thought. "But today made me realize something." He exhaled, watching the streetlights pass by, their glow stretching long shadows across the road. "I might not be on the battlefield anymore, but that doesn't mean I stopped protecting people." He shook his head, a faint chuckle escaping his lips. "There are still battles to fight. They just look a little different now." Margaret's hand squeezed his arm, her voice warm with quiet certainty. "Rick, you've always been a protector, whether it was your fellow soldiers, your family, or even a little girl who needed help. You don't walk away. That's who you are." Rick swallowed past the lump in his throat, nodding. Margaret smiled, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "And you know what? That still makes you a hero." Rick let out a soft breath, shaking his head with a wry smile. "I don't know about that." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Edo." They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Rick turned off the engine and sat for a moment, watching the flashing lights from a few remaining patrol cars reflect in the rearview mirror. He thought about Chloe, about the fear in her eyes when she had looked at him in the parking lot, and the relief when she had recognized him later. She had been minutes away from vanishing forever. But she hadn't, because Rick had listened to the voice in his gut, because he hadn't ignored the signs, because he had acted. He turned to Margaret, his expression serious but filled with a quiet resolve. "I think I found a new mission in life." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling in the dim light. "Then I guess I'd better be ready to back you up, soldier." Rick chuckled, shaking his head as he reached for her hand. "I wouldn't want anyone else by my side." And with that, he opened the door and stepped out, ready to walk into this new chapter of his life. As Rick and Margaret stepped into the police station, a sense of calm settled over him. The chaos of the night was behind them, but the weight of what had happened lingered in his chest. He had followed a feeling, just a quiet, nagging instinct, but that instinct had made all the difference. Because of it, Chloe Parker was alive. Because of it, she would go home tonight, wrapped in the arms of the family that had feared they had lost her forever. Rick had spent most of his life serving his country, believing that his mission had ended the day he took off his uniform. But today had shown him the truth. His purpose had never left him. He was still a protector, still a man who refused to turn a blind eye when something didn't feel right. Not all heroes wore capes. Not all carried weapons. Some simply listened to their gut and took a stand when no one else would. Rick Dawson may have left the battlefield, but he would never stop fighting for what was right. And that, my friends, is how one man's instincts, courage, and determination changed the course of a little girl's life forever. Rick Dawson may have retired from the battlefield, but he proved that true heroes never stop fighting for what's right. But this story isn't over yet. What happens next? What will Rick do now that he's found a new purpose? Stay tuned for part 2. where we dive deeper into his journey and the unexpected turns it takes. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. What would you have done in Rick's shoes? And of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes listening to your gut can make all the difference. See you in the next one.